Hey everyone, welcome back to Glue La La. If you're new here, my name's Jess. September is when most people start decorating for fall, so today I have 3 Dollar Tree DIYs that are perfect for fall, especially if you love decorating in the farmhouse style. Alright everyone, let's get started. For the first project, I'm using one of these 12 by 12 canvases that I found at Michael's. So I started by removing the canvas material from the frame itself, and I'm just going to be using the frame for this project. Now, since I knew I was going to be adding another backing to this frame, I didn't have to remove most of the staples off the back, but I did make sure that I removed all of the material from the back. Once I had all of the canvas material off of the frame, I decided to give it one really good coat of the Plaster Color by Waverly. Now sometimes I do like a dry brushing on a frame like this, but I really wanted more of an opaque coverage, so I laid it on pretty thick, but I did only give it one coat, and I made sure that I did the top, the sides, and the inside of the frame as well. For the inside of the frame, I found these really cool self-adhesive wall tiles at the Dollar Tree. And they're kind of a little bit of a matte gray. They're not super shiny, but I wanted to pop that pattern out just a little bit more. So I'm using the same Plaster Color, and I'm just doing a dry brush technique all over the surface of this tile. That way most of the color kind of got on the raised areas of the tile, and it created more of a shadowy effect where it was embossed. My Dollar Tree has finally started putting out more of their fall decor, and I found these really cool metal pumpkins there. And I really loved the plaid pattern that was already on this pumpkin. The only thing I didn't love about it was the raffia bow at the top, so I decided to keep this DIY pretty simple by leaving the pumpkin pretty much how it was, and I just kind of added in a little bit of my own greenery, and then I did a little bit of a lace bow out of some of the lace that you can find at the Dollar Tree, just to change up the embellishments on the pumpkin a little bit. To make the backing for this tile a little bit more sturdy, I'm taking a piece of foam board from the Dollar Tree, and since this tile is self-adhesive, I just laid it on the foam board, and then I used my utility knife to cut it down. Now this tile is about 12 by 12, which is the same size as the frame. So I did have to cut just a little bit extra off the tile itself too, just so it wouldn't hang over the edges of the frame. I was a little bit nervous about using hot glue to attach the backing to the frame because these tiles are plastic and I was afraid it was going to melt it, but it actually held up pretty well. It didn't seem to melt the tile too much. So I just used a little bit of hot glue around the edges of the frame to attach the backing. I think another alternative to using hot glue would be a staple gun. I think that would be a really good choice in this project because then you wouldn't have to worry about the glue melting the tile at all, but I just didn't happen to have a staple gun on hand on this day. To attach the pumpkin to the center of the tile, I added some tumbling tower blocks to the center of the pumpkin because it was raised up a little bit and I wanted more of a surface to glue the pumpkin on. Now I will tell you, later on the pumpkin ended up popping off of the tower blocks. Like the metal just didn't hold very well with the hot glue, so I would recommend using some E6000 for this. For the second project, I wanted to create a little bit of like a stacked pumpkin shelf sitter. So I found one of these pumpkins from the Dollar Tree, and I actually really like the print that's on it. I just don't like glitter, and they always put so much glitter on these things. So to get started, I took all the little embellishments that they had off of the front off, and I'm just using some hot glue, and I'm running hot glue as close as I can to the edge of the pumpkin, and then I'm going to lay it on some scrapbook paper. Now, I actually wanted this wood print to show on the pumpkin, and as you can see here, I put it on the wrong side. So I had to rip it off, and I actually had another piece of scrapbook paper, so Round 2, same thing. I put hot glue as close as I could to the edge of the pumpkin, and then I laid it on the wrong side of the paper so that the wood grain would show. Now, once I had the pumpkin in place on the paper, the easiest way that I like to do this is I always like to just take my sanding block and I just sand downward over the project. That way it will give the paper around the edges a little bit of almost like a burned off or ripped off look. It kind of gives it a little bit of distressing, and then you don't have to worry about trying to cut the paper off because the sanding block will do that for you. Now, if you don't like this kind of distressed look, you can always just use a utility knife or even some scissors and just cut the paper out as close as you can to the edge. You can see how sanding that off still shows the outside detail of the pumpkin. So they had these really cool pumpkins at the Dollar Tree, and I really liked it how it was. Like, I would have just kept it like that, except I couldn't find my initial on one. They only had like 2 left in my store. I think it was a W, and I don't remember what the other letter was. So I decided to pick one up anyway because I knew I could customize it to fit for me. So I started by taking off that little bow that was at the top, and I decided to paint, well, I tried to sand off the W first, but that didn't work. So then I decided to paint the center of this pumpkin with the Moss color by Waverly. Now, because that W was in black, I ended up having to give this 3 coats of paint. And it's kind of hard to see on camera, but they had the edges a little bit rough. So they had like a little bit of the wood showing on the edges. So I just tried to follow that line with my paintbrush. So while that was drying, I decided to create a little bit of a stand for the 2 pumpkins. So I'm using the tumbling tower blocks, and I'm gluing 5 blocks together end on end, so it creates like a nice long wooden piece. And I actually created 2 of these so that one could sit on the front and one could sit on the back, just to make it a little bit more stable. Once I had both rows of tumbling tower blocks glued together, I'm using the plaster color again, and I'm just kind of doing a heavy dry brushing over both of these pieces. That way it kind of gave it a little bit of that distressed look, but it also kind of left a little bit of that wood grain to show. Now, if you don't like seeing the seams where the blocks meet together, you could always run a little bit of wood filler or spackling over it to smooth those out a little bit, but that doesn't really bother me. I actually kind of like seeing those seams a little bit. I decided to decorate my pumpkins before I put them together because I thought that would just be a little bit easier. So you can see here, I made a little bow out of some black and white gingham ribbon, and I did cut an M out on my Cricut because my last name starts with M, so that's the initial that I actually wanted on that pumpkin. But if you don't have a Cricut, you could just use stickers, or you could even just hand letter it if that's something that you enjoy doing. So for the larger pumpkin, I decided to dig around in my stash and see what I had, and I had some of these burlap leaves from last year. I haven't seen them out at my Dollar Tree yet, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to come out with them. And then I also added on some of that berry garland that I just kind of spiral wrapped around a paintbrush, and then I tied a bigger bow out of some black and white striped ribbon, and I attached that to the top of the pumpkin. To assemble the pumpkins, I started by taking one of the rows of the tumbling tower blocks, and I ran a little bit of hot glue along the bottom edge of the bigger pumpkin, and I stood it up. That way I knew that the bottom edge would line up with the bottom edge of the first row of tower blocks. And then all I had to do was run a little bit of hot glue along the back and then line the blocks up with each other. That way the 2 rows of blocks kind of sandwiched in between that larger pumpkin. And then for the smaller pumpkin, because it was a little bit chunkier, I decided just to put a little bit of glue on the back and then along the bottom, and then that way it could glue to the larger pumpkin and to the bottom of the tumbling tower block. Okay, so the last project is really quick, really easy, and as I was making it, I was thinking it would make a really cool centerpiece for a bridal shower or a wedding, especially if you were doing it in kind of that farmhouse theme. So I started with one of these wood rounds from the Dollar Tree, and it does have a pretty large hole in it, so I used a little bit of spackle just to fill that hole in a little bit. Then on the back side, I decided to use some medium-sized wooden beads to act as little feet for this platform. I always buy my wooden beads from Amazon. I get a big bag, and there's a bunch of different sizes in there, and I always have that linked below. Then for the top of this, I decided to paint it the plaster color, and because of the design that was on it, I did have to give it 2 coats of paint to cover up that design. I didn't have to worry about the edges so much because they already had a little bit of a white distressing on them. So on top of the platform, I took a little jar out of my stash. I think this was from some almond butter or something like that, and I wanted to create a little bit of a band around the center of the jar. So I had this burlap ribbon on hand, but it's pretty wide, and it was definitely too wide for that jar. So I cut it down to a better width, and then once I liked the width, I pulled some strings out from both sides. That way it kind of gave it a little bit of a frayed edge. And then I was able to hot glue it onto the jar. Now, when I hot glued it on, I knew that you would be able to see the hot glue through the burlap because it has such a wide weave to it. So I only added a little bit of hot glue to the back where the 2 edges were going to meet because I didn't want to take the chance that you would see the glue coming out of the front. So then for the second layer of the jar, I took some burlap ribbon that I already had on hand, and I laid that inside the center of the first layer of burlap. And I did the same thing where I just glued it on the back side of the jar, and I put it around pretty tight, and that held it in place. So I didn't really need any glue on the other parts of the jar. Just a little bit on the back was enough. So for the final layer of ribbon, I'm using this lace ribbon that you can find at the Dollar Tree, and then I just layered that on the inside of both of the other 2 ribbons. So this is something that could be easily customized to whatever style you're doing. And since I chose to keep everything pretty neutral between the ribbons and the platform that I made, I could keep this up year round just by changing out the flowers that are inside of the jar. I struggle a little bit with flower arranging, so I like to buy already arranged bouquets. That way it makes it a little bit easier for me. So I found these 2 at the Dollar Tree, and I decided that I would use both of them in this jar, and then that way I didn't have to worry about trying to pick out flowers that would go together because they already had the work done for me. And you can find little picks like this at the Dollar Tree or at Walmart or even Michael's too. And then once I had them in the jar, I just kind of spread them out a little bit just to fill the jar in a little bit. And I did have to trim the stems down so they fit a little bit better. Here's a final look at all of the projects. My favorite this time was definitely that first one with that tile background, and I loved it even before I put the pumpkin on. I think it would make such a cool statement piece like on a gallery wall. You'll have to let me know in the comments which one is your favorite. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit the thumbs up button, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell, do all the things. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Bye!